outline of what we're going to be looking at these next few weeks. Lesson number 1, we're going to be investigating private eye, the ethics of privacy in the modern world, or lack thereof. Lesson number 2, pardon me, the ethics of forgiveness. What happens when people do things that you think they don't deserve to be forgiven? We know in Judaism we have a Day of Atonement where people should be forgiven. What happens if people act inappropriately, even they don't deserve our forgiveness? Lesson number 3, fair share, the ethics of charitable giving. What about taking money from irreputable sources, or what about giving to institutions that are somewhat less than reputable? Lesson number 4, family royalty, the ethics of filial responsibility. What kind of responsibility do we have to our parents? What responsibility do they have for us? Are there certain priorities when it comes to those we have to take responsibility for? Lesson number 5, honest to goodness, the ethics of speaking the truth. Is there ever a time where it is permitted to lie, or maybe it's obligatory to lie? And then lesson number 6, allegiance to a pledge, the ethics of honoring verbal commitments. Just to give one example, you may have heard the expression "bli neder." Right, what's bli neder?
House.
Huh?
House.
Okay, what's bli neder? The expression "bli neder." Huh?
Without.
Without a vow. So some people say, "I'll be there, bli neder," which they mean just say, "I'll be there, but I'm not making a promise." So what exactly does that mean? Are you feeling sort of wishy-washy that you don't really mean to come, so you say bli neder? Are there times that is a handshake a pledge? Or in Judaism, maybe you can agree to something, but sort of hold back, bli neder, without taking a pledge, without taking responsibility. So these are some of the things that we'll be looking at over the course of the next 6 lessons. But we're going to begin this evening with the idea of privacy. Right, in the classic novel 1984, we have that expression, "Big Brother is watching." So on some level, there is the ability to conceive of a situation where there is absolutely no privacy. Big Brother is watching. At the same time, we have a recognition sometimes that we even if we know people are sometimes watching, we find a way of working within the fact that people may be watching, and we can still have some sense of privacy. They tell of the Jew being sent to Siberia, a Jewish man being sent to Siberia, and his wife is now responsible for running everything on her own. She gets a letter in the mail from her husband in Siberia saying that all of the money that had not been paid in taxes and in fines to the government is buried in the yard. So what happens the next day? Soviet officers come in and dig up the yard to look for the money. A few days later, she receives another letter saying, "You can now go ahead and plant the potatoes." He figured out how to play the system of this lack of privacy. People may be watching, but make the most of it. At the same time, we have sort of an expectation of privacy. The Constitution, the Fourth Amendment, the right to be secure against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. And sometimes, though, there's a conflict between what is our right against unreasonable an unreasonable violation of our privacy and the common good. Recently, there was a controversy here in New York about the stop and frisk policies of the police department. The idea that there was a claim that they were being done in an attempt to keep people safe, but maybe it was targeting the minority community too much. Sometimes these ideas may be in conflict. And so there's a lot of, you fast forward to, on the one hand, an Orwellian Big Brother is watching, to an idyllic constitution of the right to privacy. In the real world, there sometimes are two opposing forces. And then think about, in the year 2013, how much data is out there being collected and shared, how much people know about us that we don't even know. In terms of when we do searches, and what we search for, and what we buy, and which websites we go to, there's I don't even really want to know how much people know about me. They probably know me better than I know myself. A movie a couple of years ago, Enemy of the State. Anybody see it? It had Gene Hackman, it had Will Smith.
Yeah.
Right, it's the only way that they collect so much data the satellites can identify where you are, what you're doing, what car you're driving at any given moment. It's a little bit scary. The only way to avoid all this is to go completely off the grid. Completely unwired, unplugged. You got to live in a little bunker and generate your own electricity with a little crank. Otherwise, there's no way in order to maintain one's privacy. But we're going to focus on the individual. We're going to give 3 examples, which will allow us to explore both some legal approaches and some Jewish approaches. We're going to be looking at what about monitoring others? What about looking? We're going to look at reading the correspondence of others, looking at mail. We live in an age when we're not talking about the post office anymore. And we're going to look at reporting gossip. What about information that you get passing on to others? What kind of rights do you have? What kind of limitations are there? So we have case study number 1. It's on page 4 of the booklet. Just take a look on your own at case study number 1. Larry, in the closet next to you, I think there are some additional books.
A lot of them.
Yeah, that's right. We have another, thankfully it's a popular course, there's another whole group of parents of Ramah students taking this course starting tomorrow, so I prepared ahead. Take a look.
Anybody else need a book?
An article in the New York Times about 3 years ago. Take a look at some of the questions that are right after the case study. Also, if you haven't finished, don't worry, take your time. But we basically see here people's expectations for privacy versus the fact that so much of what goes on in life, especially in New York City with people living in close quarters and one across from the other, and the fact that there's limited privacy unless you take steps to protect privacy. I thought it was very interesting, Suzanne Vega, right? She does it, and she writes songs even about it. It feels a little uncomfortable, but she does it anyway. Why not? Sort of, it's, we're looking into others' residence as an invasion of privacy. Or we take it a little bit further. What about a nanny cam? Right? What about an employer using a camera to monitor employees? Don't worry, I've focused the camera only on me, so no one's looking at you. You can feel at home. So some thoughts. What are some basic thoughts as to looking at other people through the window? Or a nanny cam? What are some compelling interests or lack thereof? Yes?
Well, a nanny cam seems different than just watching someone because you're paying someone for a service, so maybe you want to make sure they're actually provided.
So your boss can have a camera watching you?
I think that would be different than like in binoculars looking at someone's apartment and watching.
All right. Yeah.
Disclosure.
Disclosure, okay. What do you mean? Disclosure, so therefore I can or I can't?
Well, it tells a nanny that she's being watched. And she
okay, all right. Maybe sort of if you tell someone to do it, you're doing it, that obviates the issue. It's going to be an interesting idea in Jewish law in general. The Jewish law has the yes, the no, and the should. So it's not always so clear. Yeah.
I'll do it all the time, watching people in the camera.
Right.
There's no
Right.
problem.
Right. Okay.
I mean, I got store, I got video cameras, I'm
Right.
taking every
Right.
once in a while.
Right. Oh, so you're right. You know, sort of someone I was talking to downstairs, one of the Ramah's parents, they're like, you think about nowadays when there's cameras all over the subway. What happens if one of a crime is caught on tape, and then that video goes on the news that night, and you just have to be standing next to the person there. You shouldn't be in the office at the same time. It's sort of, our lives are much more complicated. Yeah.
Are you making a distinction between looking into somebody's house or looking at a party in a courtroom?
Okay. So you're highlighting sort of the expectation of privacy is different private versus public. Okay. Right? Different in a restaurant and a store than in the bathroom.
Right.
Okay. So, yeah.
Well, I know I like to get sunlight in coming through my windows, so I leave the shades up.
Right.
But I don't like the idea that somebody might be watching me when I'm at home. So personally,
Let's move to the suburbs.
I'm always looking out to see if anybody's
Right.
looking. But no, I'm just kidding.
So what about we take it into the level of mail? Right, that's case study number 2. It's a case that actually took place a while ago, in the mid-90s, which is, I guess people used email even back then. Right? The idea of where an employee read some email and responded in a bit of an intemperate way. You see some of the quotes there, based on some of these, the email communication from his supervisor. He said, "Let's kill the backstabbing bastards." Or, "The holiday party is a Jim Jones Kool-Aid affair." And, at some point, contrary to the assurances of confidentiality, these emails were looked at by the company, and he was notified that he would be terminated in 2 weeks. He brought a wrongful discharge suit against Pillsbury, claiming his right to privacy had been violated when the emails were intercepted. So, what do you think? Can the employer read employees' emails to ensure appropriate behavior and work efficiency?
Yes.
Yeah? You think yes?
Yeah, I mean, everybody knows the
I guess it
email
depends
is owned by the employer.
Depends if you're the
so it's
employer or
equivalent.
the employee. Right? If you're the employer, yes. If you're the
Right.
employee, no.
Everybo's got their own personal email,
Okay.
so you're an idiot
Ah,
to
well,
do it
all
on
right.
the company email.
Yeah.
Normally, when you hire somebody, there is a clause in the hiring paper saying that all emails belong to the company,
Right.
and it's not private.
Right, okay. That's sort of also like people have these sort of, privacy messages. This message is intended only for the recipient, and if that recipient's not you, then it's not for you, and you better delete it, otherwise we're going to get you. Right? The question is, are they actionable or not? Right? What if we sort of go a little bit different? What about reading a spouse's text message? Thoughts?
Well, I guess that would be different because it's family. You know.
So there's more expectation of privacy or less?
Less.
Okay.
I'd say less.
I'd say more.
Huh?
I'd say less based upon.
Spoken like a man with his wife sitting next to him.
Of course. Stupid I'm not.
That's right.
No.
Right? What if the spouse has reason to suspect there's unacceptable behavior on the part of the other? Or criminal behavior, Ruth Madoff, and what about a case where you think there's something that does not belong there? Or what if you read electronic metadata that you receive? What's metadata? Anybody know? Yeah?
That's what's left every time you change an email or
Correct.
computerized document.
Correct. There often, if someone sends a document, that document may have been revised, and there may have been other things in there that have been changed or deleted, and it can be sent to it's sort of show changes, or the tracking that's sometimes in a Word document. And sometimes if you hit the right set, sometimes the person thinks they're sending it clean when all that information is there. So they're sending you something the data that they know, but they may also be sharing with you something they don't want to share. So is that their fault? Or do you have a responsibility, it's like someone else's mail's in your mailbox. And you're like, oh, this looks interesting, and you open it up thinking that I'll tell my neighbor That, I thought it was to me. That's why it's open already. You know, you just open the mail. You don't check to see if it's really for you. And, you know, especially if it says, you know, you just won $25 million. So, you know, sort of interesting. Why is my neighbor getting mail from the White House? Oh, they open up. What about things that aren't necessarily meant for us, but come to us anyway? So we see that when it comes to issues of privacy, there can be things which may be a little bit more straightforward. Like on some level, taking your binoculars and looking at your neighbor across the street, I think many of us would sort of instinctively respond negatively towards doing that. If you do, don't tell me. But there are other times where it's a little bit more complicated. Metadata, well, you sent it. It's like, you know, you break it, you buy it. You send it, I get to read it. But what does the law say? And what does Jewish law say? So let's spend a few minutes talking about a Jewish right to privacy. Let's look on page 9, text 1a. Sometimes go around, someone will please read. We'll be reading the text in English. They're there in the Hebrew for those who want to look at that as well. Text 1a, somebody.
One may not construct windows that will face the jointly owned courtyard.
This is from the Mishnah in Baba Basra. You may not construct windows that will face a jointly owned courtyard. Right? We're worried about what's called hezek riyah. Right? You don't want to have window that is looking out into a courtyard, because the Talmud introduces something called hezek riyah. Hezek riyah literally means the damage of the being seen. Talmudic law feels that there is damage by being seen. This sounds a little bit like another concept, another very famous Jewish expression, when people will respond, "B'li ayin hara," or "kind of hara." Right? How's it going? Oh, everything's going wonderfully. B'li ayin hara. You worry about the evil eye. Hezek riyah would seem to be sort of an extension of that, but the Talmud views that as something that's actionable. We're worried that looking at other people can somehow damage that which they possess, that which they own. So you're not allowed to have windows facing this courtyard. In fact, if something would be going on and someone would be planning such a construction, according to Talmudic law, the Beit Din, the rabbinical court, can issue injunctions against the construction of such houses or such windows. If they would be built this way, once it's built, there are no penalties imposed. But the idea limits the right of the owner for where the windows are allowed to go. Yes?
If there were a street going between those two buildings,
okay, it's not the same thing. We're talking here that you're sort of looking straight down into the courtyard that other people are using. So it's not necessarily public property, it's really viewed as some sort of shared property. If there was a street going by, it would be different in terms of looking at the space. Yes?
How do you look at that when you look at New York City?
Okay.
Courtyards.
So let's look at a couple other texts relating to this, and then we'll try and understand New York City, which may not have been built according to the Talmudic law. It's certainly possible. You know, we're trying to be more consistent with Talmudic law. We're outlawing all those big gulp drinks and stuff, right? We know that's a Mishnah somewhere. No, but so let's see. But
if that's the case, let's assume totally not built in that with that look. Does someone who takes this stuff to the letter of the law choose not to live in buildings or block out their windows?
It could be. It could be. It depends how fanatical you want to be, or how compelling or how applicable the laws still are. Let's look at a couple other examples and maybe see if there's some mitigation of this. Larry, if you can pass another book forward, please.
Oh, yes.
So let's talk a little bit about. Let's look at another example of this. You know, in general, we see that one partner has the right to deny his counterpart from building a window that would create a potential invasion of privacy. Let's look at text 2a on page 11. If one's roof adjoins a neighbor's courtyard, the owner of the roof must construct a parapet 4 cubits high. Right, so if one roof adjoins a neighbor's courtyard, right, so someone's got some nice outdoor space that he uses, and the roof goes across, you have to construct a little fence. Right, the owner must construct a parapet 4 cubits high. This guy has to minimize his view so as not to be able to even potentially see the other person. If the privacy of the courtyard owner is protected to the extent that the neighbor is forced to pay to insure. Judaism places the onus on maintaining privacy. It's not this guy's problem. It's his problem. He has to build it, right? So, you may say, well, if that guy wants privacy, he has to be careful. He should build a bigger wall. He should close his blinds. He shouldn't walk around in his underwear. No. It's the other person's problem. It's the person who's tempted to look, he has to do it in such a way. Look at text 2b, if someone will please read, Rabbi Norman Lamb, Chancellor Yeshiva University today. Okay.
In those days, most activity took place in the courtyard, whereas the roof was seldom used. Thus, without the obstruction between them, the owner of the roof could see all that occurred in his neighbor's courtyard, and thus deprive him of his privacy. Therefore, it is incumbent upon the owner of the roof to construct the wall and bear all the expenses, and so avoid damaging his neighbor by denying him his privacy. It is thus not the potentially aggrieved party who would benefit from the wall who has to pay for it, but the one who threatens to perform the intrusion.
Right. That guy must build the wall. There's a significant right to privacy. Everyone is protected. Everyone's protected so much that you have to spend money to ensure that my privacy is protected. Let's look at another example. Not necessarily just the right to privacy, but the obligation to be concerned with privacy. So let's look at text number 3 on the next page. This Mishnah, also Bava Batra, section that deals with a lot of these issues relating to damages and potential damage, states, in a jointly shared courtyard, the doors and windows of the home should not be constructed directly opposite each other. Now, before we were talking about a window that looks over a courtyard. Now we're talking about a jointly shared courtyard. The doors and windows should not be constructed directly opposite each other. You can't have anything lining up in such a way. That's a no. Right, so here it's not necessarily, it's not the idea of someone's right to privacy. Here there is a proactive responsibility to ensure you don't end up looking into someone else's space. Here, the question is, didn't we already talk about windows? Didn't we already say that windows can't face a courtyard? So here we're saying you could have a window, as long as it's not opposite. What about the fact that windows look into a courtyard? Isn't this Mishnah assuming you're going to be doing something that the other Mishnah said you can't do? So the way that this is understood is that there are certain rights of privacy that can be waived. But you can't waive something like this. Right? If you don't mind the fact that a window faces the courtyard, that's not necessarily going to violate your privacy. It doesn't come that close. You may not be using that courtyard. You may not always mind who sees you. Maybe more like the public space that got mentioned before. But in a situation like this, where you will have windows, one looking into the window directly of a neighbor, or a doorway, when both doors are open, you can see one house into the other, that's more problematic. Windows into a shared courtyard, it's allowed with express permission. Windows or doors opposite each other, not an option. The idea that here we begin to see an obligation. It's not to be an obligation that in an ideal society, getting back, Sharon, to what you were saying before, in an ideal Jewish society, you don't have any sort of construction like this. Anyone familiar with a precedent of this idea of being sensitive to where the doors and windows are? Yeah?
The tents in the desert.
Excellent. Very good. The idea of, you see this in text 4a, introduced to this idea of the matovu, where Bilam sees the Jewish people and is called upon to curse them by the Moabite king, and instead he blesses them with the declaration, Matovu ohalecha Yaakov, how goodly are the tents of Jacob. And the rabbinic understanding of this is that the fact that their tents and windows were not facing each other, they were somewhat staggered in an effort to avoid people looking into each other's windows. And this is a Jewish ideal. This is introduced as a biblical ideal, which has ramifications in urban planning from an ideal Jewish perspective. So what about nowadays? So there are different suggestions that are presented as to the how it works today. A, we didn't design it, we didn't build it, we just live here. It could be that they were talking about times, especially when you talk about the doors open up into homes directly. You sort of open a door and then you can see the living room, the bedroom, kitchen, etc. Now you open up a door, you don't see very much because there's often some type of foyer antechamber. Not that, you know, you live in a studio that's 200 feet. You see this thing about the micro apartments? Something like that could be a problem. Okay, but in general, open doors, you don't necessarily see a lot of what goes on inside the house specifically. There's also a discussion that some of the mechanisms that we utilize to ensure our privacy nowadays provide a little bit more protection. So, for example, shades and the like. Also, what type of privacy is expected. So, for example, when homes are built in such close proximity, if you live on the ground floor, you can't necessarily expect privacy. This sort of we'll talk more about in terms of giving up your right to privacy, how that can work. Well, if you live in a place that everyone walking by can just see what's going on in your house and can see your business, it could be that these obligations to ensure privacy were predicated upon a more suburban existence. In cases where you have so many people so close together, there's a little bit of an implicit recognition that your privacy will not be maintained the same way. But there are other Jewish legal scholars who decry urban planning and say, if we were in charge, we would do things differently. There does not seem to be any expectation on the part of rabbinic law that you have to buy or live in apartments that conform. But this would be in an ideal world, ideal society in terms of privacy. Yes, Gary.
How about in Israel today? Do they do that? Do you think?
I think there's probably some sensitivity.
Yeah.
Keeping in mind that with regards to common courtyards, there could be we say you can give up your privacy for that. There's probably a lot less. I bet there is some sensitivity to windows, and someone mentioned before, what about roads in between? Right? The idea of sort of having everything line up is when everyone is directly across from one another. If you have streets in between, trying to create some sort of distance that might help. I'm not familiar with how careful they are in terms of this type of construction, even in Israel and in Haredi places. I'm sure someone's thought about it. Whether or not it gets built that way, is a good question.
No, because I understand that there are a lot of different fines that people pay. It's more structured than here.
Mm-hmm.
Here in America.
Mm-hmm.
People are more sensitive.
Right. Well, it's sort of interesting. So far, we've spoken a lot about protecting privacy. So what about people? None of this said I can't look. I can't build. I got to be careful. And no one said I'm not allowed to look inside. Well, I'm sorry to burst your bubble. Someone will please read on page 14, text number 5, from the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, a code of Jewish law. Don't be shy. Okay.
It is self-understood that it is forbidden for an individual to look into a courtyard to gaze upon another's activities. Certainly, peering into another's home without consent is forbidden, even if the one being monitored sees the neighbor and does not protest. It is still forbidden. It might be that the one being monitored is too embarrassed to protest. Even if one has permission from the neighbor to construct a window facing a courtyard, permission pertains only to the light gained through the window. It is by no means permission to stand at the window to gaze at the neighbor's activities.
It's self-understood. Don't be ridiculous. How can you be spending your time gazing into someone else's private life? At the same time, in the U.S., it's only illegal if it involves trespass, where you're looking, you can't be standing in the first place, or it involves video. It's illegal to video someone in his or her private property without permission. And it has to when there is a reasonable expectation on the part of the individual being observed that they have a right to privacy. So, for example, someone's in the bathroom. You're not allowed to sort of look over the door. That would be, you could be arrested for that. And you see an extension of that in text number 6. Scott Burns, Executive Director, National Director, District Attorneys Association, the Voice of America's 39,000 prosecutors said complaints like this, where one person is peering out of his or her window into another's, aren't so rare. In fact, he says such cases are made every day, but they're not prosecuted unless there's a clear determination that the person being viewed has a reasonable expectation of privacy that has been violated. When a person repeatedly stands in front of an open window, they give up the expectation of privacy. Sorry, Larry. In bigger cities,
I was sitting down.
Oh, okay. In bigger cities like New York and Chicago, people with binoculars in their apartment frequently peer into adjacent apartments without being prosecuted, even if they're trying to get a glimpse of someone undressing, said Pauline Weaver, criminal defense attorney in Fremont, California. She, along with many other attorneys interviewed for this article, never heard of a case where someone is prosecuted for looking out of their own window. So direct gazing, Jewish law, absolutely self-understood to be forbidden. Secular law, seemingly there's no legally recognizable expectation of privacy if the blinds are left open. Right, if you sort of, find this sort of long camera that extends all the way across and through the open window and opens the blinds, there may be a criminal case brought against you. But otherwise, go right ahead. You sicko. What? Yeah.
So it doesn't say anything about a patio that has only one building on one side. I mean, if you're looking down from your window at a patio owned by one building, that's permissible?
Well, no, the example would likely be the case where the roof faces someone else. The person, you have to ensure that there's something that stands, that impedes your ability to look directly at the other person.
You're looking down into your building's own patio. Right.
Is this a public space or a private space?
Private space owned by the building.
No, that's more, that would be viewed for our purposes semi-public space. And we're talking about in cases where you are able to look at something that directly impacts the individual. If you have sort of a shared courtyard of 4 families, that's a little bit more private than sort of the building's outdoor space in Manhattan, where hundreds of families have hundreds of people have access to. So we talked about the Jewish right to privacy, the obligation to protect privacy, and the self-understood responsibility to mind your own business. I think the last element of privacy that we need to spend a little time about has to do with why privacy is important. And here we have both sort of a legal and a social view as well as a Jewish view. Someone will read page 17, text 7a. Page 17, text 7a. Okay.
Privacy protects us from being misdefined and judged out of context in a world of short attention spans, a world in which information can easily be confused with knowledge. True knowledge of another person is the culmination of a slow process of mutual revelation. It requires the gradual setting aside of social masks, the incremental building of trust, which leads to the exchange of personal disclosures. It cannot be rushed. This is why, after intemperate self-revelation, in the heat of passion, one may feel something close to self-betrayal. True knowledge of another person in all of his or her complexity can only be achieved with a handful of friends, lovers, or family members.
So the idea that privacy is important because it protects us from being misjudged. Rosen further talks about the idea in 7b, on the next page. Without a commitment to privacy, the Harvard legal philosopher Charles Freed has written in one of the most thoughtful essays on the subject, respect, love, and friendship and trust are simply inconceivable. Friendship and romantic love can't be achieved without intimacy, and intimacy in turn depends on the selective and voluntary disclosure of personal information that we don't share with anyone else. Behind the protective shield of privacy, 2 individuals can relax the boundaries of self and lose themselves in each other. And there's also, with regard to friendship and relationships, flourish. We know the expression TMI, too much information. Right? Sometimes, if you don't know a person all that well, you can fall prey to too much information. There's certain things which we share with people we have different levels of a relationship with So whether it be in terms of our own ability to have a proper sense of who we are and not being misjudged, which would be hampered with information about us that we don't want publicized getting out, or the ability to create strong relationships, close relationships, intimate relationships, is impeded when there is a lack of privacy. From a religious perspective, there's something that's called tzniut. There's something that is really the element of, it's usually translated as modesty. Tzniut or tznius is sometimes associated with how people dress, especially how women dress. Tzniut is much more than that. Tzniut is a certain element of keeping certain things private, keeping certain things to ourselves. We go back for a moment to what we mentioned before about Bilam. And Bilam saw the Jewish people's tents, and he saw that they were so great because no one was looking into directly into the tent of another. This is understood by the commentaries on that section about recognizing that each tribe was distinct in their service of God. Everyone has their unique mission. And no one was looking at the business of the other one in order to interfere with their mission or to co-opt their mission. Everyone has a specific purpose, unique divine service, a unique personality. Privacy protects this. There needs to be some room to grow and develop away from the prying eyes of others, even sometimes if it's in an innocent perspective. Look at text number 9. This is Edward Blaustein, lawyer, philosopher, educator. The man who was compelled to live every minute of his life among others, and whose every need, thought, desire, fancy, or gratification is subject to public scrutiny, has been deprived of his individuality and human dignity. Such an individual merges with the mass. His opinions being public tend never to be different. His aspirations being known tend always to be conventionally accepted ones. His feelings being openly exhibited tend to lose the quality of unique personal warmth to become the feelings of every man. Such a being, although sentient, is fungible. He is not an individual. I know that when I saw this text, it brings to mind, there's a statement from the Talmud, he who has no home is not a person. Right. It doesn't mean that you have to have a specific home made out of bricks and mortar. It's not about owning versus renting, but it's about someone who has their own place, their own space to develop. Or in the words of the prophet Isaiah, it is the glory of man to reside in a home. The idea that having this fortress of solitude, if we want to invoke Superman terms, allows the person to develop in a way, in a certain private way, that isn't possible otherwise, to develop a distinct path. Also thinking about, since I like to throw in a few other movies, Truman Show.
Bingo.
You were thinking that too? And Truman Show is basically about a person who is completely under the microscope. Every single thing is monitored. It's sort of like a Big Brother taken to the extreme. And so that is, this is not just sort of a social or psychological or an emotional way of developing. This is also viewed as something that can be very special religiously. Allowing for the privacy allows you to meet the real, distinct you. And this is the Jewish idea of tzniut, and that's why it can't be waived. You can't just say, I don't want my right to privacy. It's something that's part of who we are, and therefore is essential to our development. It's not something that we can just let people in automatically. And that's the element of privacy, Jewish approach, some social science insights that parallel and complement these sources complement each other, looking at it from a legal point of view in terms of the right to privacy, the obligation to protect privacy, the responsibility not to invade someone's privacy, even if it's not about protecting one's own privacy, and the role of privacy in a person's development and as a religious ideal. So, we're beginning to encounter some themes which will help us understand or be able to answer some of our initial questions in terms of the case studies that we saw earlier, in terms of looking at how what it's like to be a peeping tom, in terms of what Judaism says, I think we're all in agreement that Judaism would not like that type of behavior, while secular law would not necessarily see this as action. So what about the mail? Let's talk about the mail. Right? It's through rain or snow or even sleet. Supposedly the mail gets in while the post office loses $25 million a day. You know that? It's, by the way, the price of stamps went up by a penny today, so be careful. That's, you got to get those forever stamps, by the way. Very helpful. Very helpful. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the mail. Interestingly enough, the Talmud has a lot to say about doors and windows, but never mentions the idea of reading other people's stuff. It seems to be concerned with what you may see, but it doesn't seem to protect a person's mail. And the first time it appears textually is something called a cherem of Rabbeinu Gershom. Cherem of Rabbeinu Gershom, where he said it's forbidden to look at the writings one sends to another without permission. Rabbeinu Gershom's ban. The Hebrew word is cherem. So really, Rabbi Gershom, who was active in so the Middle Ages, the 9th century, 10th century, excuse me. The idea, he never said you can't read other people's mail. He said if you read someone else's mail, you will be thrown out of the community. You'll be excommunicated. And you may be thinking, big deal, I'll just go somewhere else. Well, back in the day, it was much more complicated. You didn't want to be excommunicated because you really had nowhere else to go. You had your sanctuary of the Jewish community, which is generally threatened by outside society in general. And if you get excommunicated, you're being thrown to the wolves. So there's really no, you don't want to be excommunicated. And that's, but this is what, this ban that was proclaimed by the early sages against one who looks without consent at the writing that one person sends to another. So this was the initial concern. So this was a cherem of Rabbeinu Gershom. Anyone ever hear Rabbeinu Gershom in another context? That name sound familiar? Anyone? So you're probably familiar with the rule, but not the author of the rule. Rabbeinu Gershom had another famous cherem about you're not allowed to have more than one wife. It's all his fault, or all thanks to him, depends on how you look at it. And it's the same thing, because we know that Judaism does not forbid multiple wives, because the patriarchs had multiple wives, and we see this throughout history. However, Rabbeinu Gershom said that if someone takes a second wife, they'll be excommunicated. I think that in retrospect, it makes a lot of sense. In general, multiple wives didn't always work out for our patriarchs either. So it was something that caught on and has become basically universally accepted. The last holdouts were the Yemenite Jews, who, when they came from Yemen in the early days of the state of Israel, came with multiple wives. But now it's no longer legal, it's no longer in practice. So Rabbeinu Gershom's cherem is followed. He said these rules for 1,000 years. So I remember it was sort of at the end of like the late 1980s, people were thinking that the 1,000 years were up. So the question is, who's going to renew the ban? I guess, we've sort of accepted it. But there was years ago, it was not uncommon for yeshiva students, sort of these, the ultra-Orthodox yeshiva students who spent time away from their hometown studying, including some of the married students, would leave town for months at a time and studying in the yeshiva because there weren't as many yeshivas accessible. So at the yeshiva in Volozhin, which is a prominent yeshiva from Eastern Europe, was really the first and the most prominent. So the head of the yeshiva, the Rosh Yeshiva, would read all the telegrams just to make sure that everything was in order. So one day he called a student into his office and he showed him a telegram and said, Mazel Tov, your wife had a baby boy. You have to go home. And the student said, well, thank you, Rabbi, for the news. It's very exciting. But which one of my wives is it? And the rabbi said, what are you talking about? Don't you know that Rabbeinu Gershom says you can only have one wife? He said, don't you know that Rabbeinu Gershom says you can't read other people's mail? When we teach people too much, they come right back at us. So, but the question is how, the Talmud goes to great lengths and a lot of trouble in the details in terms of where the windows are, and the house, and the roof, and everything like that. What about people's personal property? What about their letters? So why is the Talmud silent on this? Any thoughts? Yeah?
Was it just the literacy rate at that time?
Okay, maybe people just weren't really reading. Could be. Any other thoughts? I think about what the rabbi said about why peeping is forbidden. It's self-evident. Why should you read other people's mail? It's their stuff, it's their belonging. And it could be that when the rabbi decided to make his statement against reading other people's mail, maybe more people were reading, or unfortunately, maybe more people were reading other people's mail. And the sort of degradation, the morals of society prompted Rabbeinu Gershom to get involved in this case. And it was something that required to be enforced. And we see this in text number 12. Right? People would write on their letters this idea, a malediction, sort of a curse against anyone who might read the letter without permission. So should one be concerned about this and therefore refrain from reading the letter without permission? Right? Seems like a self-evident question. You're not allowed to react, so why are you asking the question in the first place? And so the rabbi responded, of course. Either way, it's forbidden to meddle into a private person's affairs. Torah says you should not be a gossip monger, and there's no difference between gossiping to others and gossiping to oneself. You didn't need Rabbeinu Gershom to tell you not to do something, said Rabbi Yisrael Yaakov Chagiz. The idea was you're not allowed to, this is information that's not for you. This is a term in Hebrew called rechilut, and we'll talk more about this type of speech in a moment. But this is information that's not relevant to you. It's not relevant to you. It's forbidden anyway. But the idea, it seems to be that Rabbeinu Gershom was reinforcing and reminding people how serious it was. They were no longer put off by God telling them not to, so the rabbi was required to remind them not to. We're reading this week's Torah portion, the Ten Commandments. So one of the Ten Commandments is thou shalt not steal. And so I remember when there was every now and then we encounter headlines about seemingly observant Jews who are cutting corners when it comes to taxes or other types of regulations regarding business and money. And I remember someone pointing out if thou shalt not steal was a footnote in a legal work written 100 years ago, then it would be followed, as opposed to being just explicitly written in the Torah as a commandment. Things which are so self-evident don't seem to be enough to be followed. It requires an enforcement or a reinforcement from a seemingly extraneous way. That's the only way people will focus on them. Nevertheless, Rabbi Chagiz here introduces the idea that no, it's obvious, because this is a forbidden type of information to be transmitted from one person to another. Rabbeinu Gershom just reinforced it. Yes?
So what about, there's a Geniza that just found in Afghanistan or in whatever,
Right.
and it's supposed to contain some private letters.
Right. It's an interesting question. You know, I think that let's flesh this out a little bit to see, are there exceptions? Are there times where you don't have a right to privacy? Is there a statute of limitations? Let's see. And we may be able to understand it better, as opposed to looking at this just as Rabbeinu Gershom said he can. But what type of information may be exchanged and shared, and what type cannot be shared in exchange. So, rechilut literally means peddling. Peddling. Peddlers. People who went from place to place selling their wares. Here, the rechilut is peddling in non-essential information. Did you hear about X, Y, and Z? And let's look at text number 3, text number 13, Maimonides' definition of rachil. If someone will please read that. Don't all volunteer at once. Just shout it out.
Who is a rachil? One who peddles tidbits from one person to another, saying, so said this one, I heard so-and-so regarding this one. Even if it is true, it destroys the world. Included in this prohibition is a transgression that is much more severe, lashon hara, speaking disparagingly about others, even if speaking the truth. The one who spreads lies about another is known as a motzi shem ra.
So you see there in figure 1.1 on page 23 the various types of improper information to be shared. You have rechilut, which is gossip. Is the information false? No. Is the information disparaging? No. But it's extraneous, it's not relevant to you, you can't share. Lashon hara, which we're very familiar with, lashon hara, negative gossip. Is the information false? No, it's true. Is the information disparaging? Yes. Lashon hara is forbidden as well. Then the worst is motzi shemra. Is the information false? Yes. This is lying about something. So these are the categories of the types of prohibited exchange of information or discussion, which is why the rabbis say, what's the best method of success? Shtika, silence. You don't talk, you're not going to violate any of this. All right. So when with those of us who do talk, it becomes a little bit more complicated. But at the end of the day, Rabbeinu Gershom's ban was just strengthening of the idea: if the information is not for you, it's just sort of out there. It's not something that you should be involved in. It's not something you should be reading. You have. So let's. Is this always true? Can someone present a scenario where there may be some information that's not really relevant, but there may be a compelling reason for it to be shared? Yes.
Someone having a baby?
Someone having a baby. Okay. Well, let's play that out a little bit. Let's say I know that someone is pregnant. Should I be, telling you the name and identity of that person, sharing with you that so and so is pregnant?
But even, all right, so maybe some people could say yes because they didn't want to know.
Right.
But even just having a baby. So if your friend has a kid and
right.
you run into another friend and say, oh, so and so just had a baby. This is wonderful news.
Ah, okay.
But it's not disparaging. It's not hurtful.
Okay.
But it's still gossip.
All right. So could be. It could be. Sometimes maybe it's the person themselves who is the determining factor of whether that's information that can be shared or not. So if someone tells you that Sarah is pregnant, for you to go tell other people about that, that might be more problematic, unless Sarah had said, I'm pregnant, tell the world. So for example, nowadays there's something very, I was not aware of this, my wife told me about it, she's more fluent in Facebook than I am, because she saw a posting on Facebook that someone had a party, and this party was the gender announcement party for a woman who was a couple months pregnant. And what happens these days is you go for the ultrasound, they figure out what is the gender of the fetus, and that information is given the radiologist gives